Have you ever witnessed a miracle happen over a simple bowl of food? In a world of five-star chefs and million-dollar kitchens, a powerful CEO's daughter was slowly wasting away, refusing every gourmet dish placed before her. That is, until an unassuming young woman, with nothing but raw talent and a desperate secret, created a meal that changed everything. What happened next defied all logic. The ice-cold CEO immediately proposed marriage to this mysterious chef. But behind this impulsive decision lies a web of deception, hidden identities, and a race against time to save a dying mother. This isn't just a story about food. It's about how far someone will go for family, and how sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the most unexpected places. Wow! Can you believe a single meal could unravel such an incredible story of love, secrets, and sacrifice? If this tale of miracles and hidden truths touched your heart, hit that like button to spread the inspiration. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope can come from the simplest moments. And drop a comment below. What would you cook to save someone you love? Let's keep this emotional journey going. Xiao Zishan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, gazing down at the sprawling cityscape that bent to his will. From this vantage point, the world seemed small, controllable, exactly how he preferred it. His reflections stared back at him. Immaculate suit, perfect posture, not a single strand of his salt and pepper hair out of place. The epitome of power contained in human form. But the folder clutched in his hand told a different story. Medical reports, alarming numbers, graphs pointing downward where they should trend up. His daughter was disappearing before his eyes, and for the first time in his life, Xiaoyan was utterly powerless. "Sir," his assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. "The specialist from Switzerland has arrived." Zishan didn't turn around. "Show him in, and bring the previous nutritional assessments." The Swiss doctor was the 7th specialist in 3 months. Before him came experts from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, a celebrated nutritionist who worked with Olympic athletes, 2 eating disorder specialists from London, and a holistic medicine practitioner from Japan who charged more per hour than most people earned in a month. Each arrived with impressive credentials and left with the same defeated expression. His daughter's anorexia had become a fortress that no amount of medical expertise could breach. "Mr. Xiao," the Swiss doctor said 2 hours later, removing his glasses with a weary gesture that Zishan had come to recognize as prelude to failure. "I believe we should discuss inpatient options again. Your daughter's condition." "Unacceptable." Zishan cut him off, rising from his chair. His voice remained perfectly modulated, betraying none of the desperation clawing at his insides. "Money is no object. Resources are unlimited. There must be a solution we haven't tried." The doctor hesitated. "Sir, this isn't a problem that responds to financial resources or influence. Your daughter's relationship with food is complex and psychological. Then find me someone who understands both food and psychology," Zishan said, dismissing the doctor with a gesture. Alone again, he loosened his tie, a rare concession to the pressure mounting inside him. The business newspapers on his desk screamed warnings he'd been trying to ignore. Xiao empire shows cracks, competitors circle as CEO's focus wavers, board meeting called to address leadership concerns. For 20 years, he had built his conglomerate with ruthless precision. He'd crushed competitors, orchestrated hostile takeovers, and controlled the fates of thousands of employees with the same calculated detachment that made him legendary in business circles. That same control extended to his personal life. His fleet of custom Rolls-Royces, his collection of rare artifacts, his ownership of the exclusive cloud-top villas that celebrities begged to rent. Yet his daughter continued to fade away, immune to his influence, indifferent to his power. His phone buzzed. His head of security. "Sir, we've received intelligence that Tech Global is preparing to make a move on our semiconductor division. They believe you're distracted." Zishan ended the call without responding. They weren't wrong. For the first time in his career, he was vulnerable. His rivals could sense it, like sharks detecting blood in water. He pressed the intercom. Bring me the list of chefs. If medical science had failed, perhaps there was another approach. In the past month, he had flown in culinary masters from around the world. A 3-star Michelin chef from Paris, a celebrated sushi master from Paris, a celebrated sushi master from Tokyo, even a renowned pastry chef who had once prepared desserts for royalty. Each had crafted exquisite dishes designed to tempt the most reluctant palate. His daughter had refused to take even a single bite. The latest medical report sat open on his desk. Critical weight threshold breached. Cardiac concerns. Recommendations for feeding tubes and hospitalization, highlighted in urgent red. Time was running out. That evening, Zishan visited his daughter's room, as he did every night. The staff had warned him not to react to her appearance, but the shock still hit him like a physical blow. Her once vibrant eyes now seemed too large for her hollowed face. Her collarbones protruded sharply beneath her silk pajamas. "I brought you something," he said, setting down a small box containing an intricately crafted chocolate sculpture from the world's most celebrated chocolatier. She glanced at it without interest. "I'm not hungry, Father." The words echoed like they had 100 times before. He wanted to shout to command her to eat as he would command an employee to meet a deadline. But his daughter's illness mocked his authority, reminding him that some things couldn't be controlled through sheer force of will or financial might. Later that night, alone in his study, Zishan reviewed security footage of his daughter secretly disposing of food, a ritual she had perfected over months. The sight of her methodically hiding food in tissues, pockets, and even houseplants sent a shudder through him. This was an enemy he couldn't intimidate, bribe, or destroy. His executive team had noticed the change in him. Meetings he once dominated with an iron focus now found him distracted, checking his phone for updates from his daughter's caretakers. Decisions that once came effortlessly now seemed trivial compared to the life-or-death struggle happening in his own home. "Sir." His chief of staff appeared at the door. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow. There are concerns about the direction of the company and your personal circumstances." Zishan simply nodded, his mind already racing ahead to a new possibility. If expertise failed, perhaps a different approach was needed, one that broke all conventions. He'd built his empire by identifying opportunities others overlooked. Perhaps this situation required the same innovative thinking. "Cancel the board meeting," he said suddenly, "and contact Peer." The next morning, news outlets across the country ran the shocking announcement. Xiao Zishan, notoriously private CEO of the Xiao Group, was hosting an unprecedented cooking competition. Anyone who could prepare a dish his daughter would eat would receive an extraordinary reward, anything within his vast power to grant, including, if desired, his hand in marriage. "Sir, with respect," his peer director stammered. "The marriage clause has created a media frenzy. The board is in uproar. Your public image, my public image means nothing if my daughter dies," Zishan said coldly. "Let them talk. Let them talk. Let them come. Someone must succeed where all others have failed." The competition opened 3 days later. Thousands applied. Renowned chefs seeking validation, entrepreneurs hoping for investment, opportunists dreaming of marrying into wealth. Zishan cared nothing for their motives. Only results mattered now. Each day brought new faces, new dishes, new failures. His daughter turned away from elaborate creations, exotic ingredients, and psychological tactics alike. Meanwhile, the business empire he had built began showing visible cracks. Stock prices fluctuated. Key executives were being approached by competitors. Board members openly questioned his judgment. For the first time in his life, Xiao Zishan felt genuine fear. Not for his company or his reputation, but for something far more precious that he had taken for granted until it began slipping away. On the competition's 7th day, security flagged an unusual applicant. A young woman with no culinary credentials, no restaurant experience, not even a formal cooking education, just a simple claim: "I can help her." Under normal circumstances, such an applicant wouldn't have made it past the first screening, but desperation had humbled Zishan. He had watched world-famous chefs fail, Perhaps unconventional credentials offered hope, where conventional credentials offered hope, where convention had failed. "Let her try," he instructed, his voice betraying the fatigue of sleepless nights and constant worry. Little did he know that this decision would change everything. The young woman called herself Lin Yu, and unlike the parade of celebrated chefs before her, she carried no expensive knives, demanded no ecstatic ingredients, and boasted no impressive techniques. She simply asked to use the kitchen alone, requesting only basic, wholesome ingredients that any ordinary household might have. While Lin Yu requested only simple ingredients in the Xiao kitchen, her mind was elsewhere, across the city where the steady hum of medical machinery had become the soundtrack to her life. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Here in the gleaming mansion, where wealth flowed like water, while in her tiny apartment on the city's forgotten edge, her mother lay unconscious, tethered to devices that consumed what little money Lin Yu managed to scrape together. As Lin Yu returned each night to that cramped apartment, she would sit beside her mother's bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping that confirmed life still lingered. The building was dilapidated, paint peeling from walls that had witnessed decades of struggle, yet it had been home until 3 months ago, when her mother had collapsed in the modest kitchen they once shared meals in. The diagnosis came with the weight of a death sentence: end-stage renal failure. Her mother needed a kidney transplant that would cost $3 million, a sum so astronomical it might as well have been $3 billion to someone who worked double shifts at local restaurants just to afford basic necessities. "Just breathe, Mom," Lin Yu would whisper each night, carefully adjusting the thin blanket over her mother's frail form. "I'm going to fix this. I promise." The words hung in the air, sincere but hollow, as the reality of their situation pressed down upon her shoulders. The psychological toll was immense. Every day watching the only person who had ever truly loved her slip further away, while juggling the overwhelming responsibilities of caregiving, working, and desperately searching for solutions. Lin Yu had inherited exceptional culinary talents, but not the recognition or opportunities that could have translated those skills into financial security. Her grandmother, a master of traditional healing cuisine, had passed down ancient techniques through countless hours in their humble kitchen. "Remember, child," her grandmother would say, placing Lin Yu's small hands over aromatic herbs. "Food is not just sustenance. It is not just sustenance. It is medicine for both body and soul." Those lessons had formed the foundation of Lin Yu's remarkable abilities, a gift that connected generations but failed to put food on their own table or money in their pockets. The irony wasn't lost on Lin Yu that she could create dishes capable of healing ailments that modern medicine struggled with, yet she couldn't heal the person who mattered most. Her skill had remained hidden in the shadows, while she quietly mentored a man who now called himself the culinary king, a chef whose restaurants commanded months-long waiting lists and whose cookbooks sold millions. He had been her student once, learning the secrets of balance and harmony in flavors that had been passed through Lin Yu's family for generations. Now he moved through exclusive circles while she remained invisible, the true artisan behind his acclaim. It was after a particularly disheartening hospital visit, where doctors had gently suggested preparing for the inevitable, that Lin Yu found herself approached by a well-dressed man in the hospital corridor. "I know about your situation," he said, voice low and eyes scanning for potential listeners. "And I know about your abilities in the kitchen. I have a proposition that could save your mother's life." The offer was simple, yet monstrous in its implications. Assume the identity of another woman, infiltrate the Xiao household, using her culinary skills as entry, and gather information that would be valuable to certain interested parties. In exchange, they would provide both the $3 million for her mother's surgery and, most crucially, a kidney donor. "We have connections," the man explained with unsettling casualness, "to organ sources that bypass the waiting lists." The implications turned Lin Yu's stomach. She understood enough about organ sources to recognize the darkness lurking behind such euphemisms. The black market for transplants, thrived on desperation, just like hers, likely exploiting vulnerable people, coerced by poverty or other forms of desperation. Yet, as she looked down at her mother's medical chart, with its grim prognosis, the moral clarity she had always prided herself on began to blur around the edges. "You have until tomorrow to decide," the man said, leaving a burner phone on the hospital chair beside her. "This is your mother's only chance." That night, Lin Yu paced their small apartment, the decision tearing her apart. Every principle she held dear: honesty, integrity, using her culinary gifts only for healing, stood in opposition to what she was considering. But principles wouldn't keep her mother alive. The American healthcare system had already pushed countless families into medical bankruptcy, and Lin Yu had nothing left to sell, no assets to liquidate, no wealthy relatives to beg from. She was facing the same impossible choice that had broken families across the country: financial ruin or watching a loved one die. When morning came, Lin Yu had made her decision. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number on the burner phone. "I'll do it," she said simply, "but I need proof, both the money and confirmation about the donor, before I take a single step into that house." The arrangements were made with disturbing efficiency. Documents appeared showing a kidney match had been located. A bank account was created with the first installment of payment. Lin Yu was given a complete profile of the woman she would become, along with carefully crafted documentation that would pass initial scrutiny. She memorized details about a life that wasn't hers, practiced a signature that felt foreign on her hand, and stood before the mirror repeating a name that wasn't her own until it began to feel natural on her tongue. On her last night before entering the Xiao household, Lin Yu sat beside her mother's bed, the machines humming their steady rhythm. She took her mother's unresponsive hand, noting how the skin that once taught her to feel the perfect texture of dough now felt paper-thin and cool to the touch. "I'm doing something terrible to save you," she whispered, tears finally breaking through the determined facade she'd maintained for months. "I hope someday you can forgive me." Lin Yu leaned forward and gently kissed her mother's forehead. "I'll come back with everything we need," she promised, "no matter what it costs me." The next morning, Lin Yu stood before her small wardrobe, selecting modest, unassuming clothes that would become her disguise, not because they were elaborate, but because they were genuine. Her deception would lie not in flashy presentations or technical showmanship, but in the simple, honest food she would create. Her culinary skills were her only true weapon. Honed through generations of wisdom rather than formal training. As she prepared to leave, Lin Yu packed a small pouch of special herbs, her grandmother's legacy. These weren't exotic ingredients that would impress the wealthy. They were humble elements that carried centuries of healing wisdom. Her hand hesitated over a worn notebook filled with her grandmother's recipes and wisdom, finally deciding to bring it as both talisman and guide. The worn notebook, in Lin Yu's hands, became more than a talisman. It transformed into the bridge between ancient wisdom and a desperate present. While modern medicine had reached its limits with elaborate machines and expensive treatments, Lin Yu carried something more potent. Generations of knowledge passed down through women whose healing abilities had been dismissed as mere folk remedies. The humble herbs she'd packed weren't just ingredients. They were her weapons in a battle everyone else had surrendered. As she entered the gleaming Xiao mansion kitchen, Lin Yu felt the weight of skeptical stares from the staff. They'd seen this scene play out dozens of times before. Another hopeful cook destined for the same failure as their predecessors. The head chef, a stern man with 3 Michelin stars to his name, barely acknowledged her presence with a curt nod. His expression said everything. What could this ordinary young woman possibly accomplish where culinary masters had failed? "She won't last an hour," a sous chef whispered, not bothering to lower his voice. "The daughter hasn't taken more than 2 bites of anything in months." Lin Yu set down her worn bag, her fingers tracing the faded characters on her grandmother's notebook. The kitchen itself was a monument to excess. imported Italian marble countertops, custom Japanese knives displayed like museum pieces, and equipment that cost more than what most restaurants earned in a year. She surveyed the space, noting how the sterile perfection felt devoid of the one element essential to healing food: heart. "I'll need a clay pot, please," she requested quietly, "and a wooden spoon, not metal." The staff exchanged amused glances, as if she'd asked for a cauldron and magic wand. The head chef gestured dismissively toward a storage closet. "Whatever antiques you're looking for would be in there. We don't use such primitive tools here." Lin Yu thanked him and retrieved a dust-covered clay pot from the back of the closet. She washed it thoroughly, her movements deliberate and reverent, unlike the frantic energy that had characterized previous chefs. Their dramatic flourishes and showy techniques. Lin Yu worked with measured calm. She requested only basic ingredients: ginger, scallions, bone broth, rice, and a few of the herbs from her grandmother's pouch. "That's all?" asked a kitchen assistant incredulously. "No truffles? No foie gras?" The last chef created a 23-ingredient consomme with gold leaf. Lin Yu smiled softly. Sometimes healing requires stripping away complexity rather than adding to it. She remembered her grandmother's words: "When the body rejects nourishment, begin with what is familiar and pure." As the staff watched, with barely concealed contempt, Lin Yu began preparing her dish with what seemed like ritualistic precision. Each ingredient was handled with intention. The ginger sliced paper, thin to release its warming properties. The scallions cut at a specific angle to preserve their vitality. She simmered the broth slowly in the clay pot, occasionally murmuring words too quiet for others to hear. Not incantations, but reminders of her grandmother's teachings about the energy food carries. "Is she talking to the food?" one of the assistants snickered. The head chef watched with narrowed eyes. His expression shifted from dismissal to curiosity as he observed her technique, unconventional but undeniably precise. There was something in her methodology that even his classical training couldn't readily dismiss. Lin Yu added the herbs from her pouch with careful consideration, measuring amounts by eye rather than scale. These weren't exotic ingredients that would impress wealthy patrons. They were humble elements carrying centuries of healing wisdom. The aroma that began filling the kitchen was unlike the complex fragrances of previous culinary attempts. It was simpler, somehow more fundamental, evoking memories, rather than gastronomy. One by one, the kitchen staff found themselves drawing closer, pulled by a scent that reminded them of childhood comforts and safety. The head chef inhaled deeply, momentarily transported to his grandmother's kitchen from 40 years earlier. "What is that smell?" he asked, his professional detachment momentarily forgotten. "It's home," Lin Yu replied simply. When the dish was complete, it appeared disappointingly ordinary, a humble bowl of congee adorned with minimal garnishes. After weeks of witnessing culinary spectacles that resembled art installations more than food, the staff couldn't hide their disappointment. "That's it? That's what you think will succeed, where everything else failed?" The head chef gestured at the simple bowl incredulously. Lin Yu nodded. "Food isn't just about appearance or even taste. It's about emotional connection." She carefully arranged the bowl on a tray with a small spoon. Not silver as was customary in the mansion, but ceramic. The moment she was escorted to Zishan's private quarters marked the first time Lin Yu truly witnessed the gravity of the situation. The CEO's daughter sat by a window, a ghost of adolescence, skin stretched across prominent collarbones, hair limp against her scalp, and eyes that seemed decades older than her young face. Her thin arms rested listlessly on the armrests of an overstuffed chair that only emphasized her diminished presence. Lin Yu approached slowly, not with the theatrical flourish of previous chefs who had promised miracles, but with the quiet confidence of someone offering solace rather than spectacle. "I made this for you," she said simply, placing the tray on a small table. No grand introduction, no pressured promises. Zishan turned, her hollow gaze meeting Lin Yu's. In that moment of connection, something unspoken passed between them, one soul recognizing another's pain. The young girl's eyes traveled from Lin Yu's face to the humble bowl, and something flickered across her features, not excitement or interest, but perhaps the faintest recognition. "It's just rice porridge," Zishan said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Yes," Lin Yu acknowledged, "but it carries something more." The room fell silent as Zishan cautiously lifted the spoon, an act that had become fraught with anxiety and fear. The staff held their breath as they had dozens of times before, expecting the familiar pattern. A polite taste followed by elaborate excuses. Even Xiao, watching from the doorway, prepared himself for disappointment. The first spoonful passed Zishan's lips. She paused, expression unreadable. Then something extraordinary happened. She took another bite without prompting, and another. Each mouthful seemed to bring subtle changes, her rigid posture softening, her breathing deepening. By the fifth spoonful, her eyes had closed, tears gathering at the corners. "It tastes like," she whispered, "like when I was little, before Mom." Her voice trailed off, but her hand continued, bringing spoon to mouth in a rhythm that seemed to heal with each repetition. The simple act of consuming this familiar, comforting meal created a feeling of safety and stability that had been absent for months. The sensory experience, the taste, smell, and texture acted as an emotional anchor, offering a sense of predictability in Zishan's uncertain world. As she continued eating, color gradually returned to her pale cheeks. Not dramatically, but undeniably. The transformation wasn't just physical. Something in her demeanor shifted, as if a heavy barrier had begun to crack. For the first time in months, she was doing more than just existing. She was participating in the most fundamental act of self-preservation. Xiao stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, his normally composed expression replaced by naked astonishment. He watched as his daughter emptied the bowl, something no amount of medical intervention or culinary extravagance had accomplished. The emotional impact of this simple meal had succeeded where complex prescriptions and exotic ingredients had failed. The head chef, who had followed to witness the inevitable rejection, stood speechless. His culinary philosophy, built on complexity, technique, and presentation, crumbled before the power of food prepared with intention and understanding of emotional nourishment. As the last spoonful of congee disappeared between his daughter's lips, Xiao Zishan's calculating mind had already reached a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. The silence in that room held more significance than any business merger he'd ever negotiated. A father witnessing what many would consider an ordinary moment, but what he recognized as his daughter's first step back toward life. His normally impassive face, trained through decades of high-stakes corporate warfare to reveal nothing, now betrayed a storm of emotions that startled even his most seasoned staff. "Ms. Lin," he said, rising from his chair with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. The room fell silent, not from the power of his voice, which remained unnaturally soft, but from the intensity radiating from his posture. "What you've accomplished today goes beyond service. You've done what teams of specialists and renowned chefs could not." The household staff exchanged glances, sensing the unusual crack in their employer's typically impenetrable demeanor. His daughter looked up, a flicker of confusion crossing her features as color continued returning to her cheeks, a physical transformation matched by her father's emotional one. "I'm prepared to offer you a permanent position in this household," he continued, the words measured and precise. Then, without warning or preamble, he added, "as my wife." The collective intake of breath from the staff created a momentary vacuum in the room. Lin Yu froze, her hands still clutching the empty bowl, mind racing to process the statement that had just shattered her carefully constructed plan. Marriage had never been part of the arrangement. Proximity, yes. Access, certainly. But this level of intimacy threatened to expose every aspect of her deception. "Father?" his daughter questioned, the first word directed at him voluntarily in weeks. The head of security, a former military man with eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward slightly, his stance communicating clear suspicion of this unknown woman who had appeared from nowhere and now stood to marry into one of the country's wealthiest families. After preparing a single meal, "Mr. Xiao," Lin Yu finally managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is unexpected. I only wish to help your daughter." "And you have," he replied, the businessman in him resurfacing, "which is precisely why I need you to remain permanently." The last word hung in the air like a negotiation tactic, which of course it was. Later that evening, Lin Yu found herself in Xiao's private study, a space that reflected its owner, intimidating in its perfection, with every object precisely positioned for maximum impact. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city below, a constant reminder of the empire he commanded. When he spoke, he did so with his back to her, staring out at the skyline he had helped reshape. "I trust you understand that my proposal is not sentimental in nature," he said, his voice having regained its characteristic control. "I am a practical man facing an extraordinary situation." Lin Yu remained silent, studying his reflection in the darkened glass. His fingers, which she noticed were marked with faint calluses, despite his current wealth, tapped rhythmically against the windowsill, the only outward sign of emotion. "My daughter has eaten properly for the first time in months because of you. Whatever you did, whatever you know, I need it, and in my experience, the surest way to secure valuable assets is through binding contracts." He turned then, his expression unreadable. "Marriage is simply the most efficient contract for our purposes." The clinical nature of his assessment should have been offensive, but Lin Yu recognized the psychological manipulation beneath it. The way he framed his desperation as strategic thinking, his emotional need as a business decision. It was the approach of a man accustomed to control, now using every tactic to regain it in a situation where he had been powerless. "You're asking me to become your wife solely to keep me cooking for your daughter," she stated, wanting the terms clear between them. "Initially, yes." His directness was unexpected, though public perception will require us to present a more conventional narrative. Lin Yu thought of her mother lying in the hospital bed, machines keeping her alive while mounting bills threatened to end treatment. She thought of the promise she had made to her conspirators. Integrate herself into the household, gain trust, but maintain emotional distance. Marriage was the furthest thing from emotional distance. "What if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you would be free to leave with appropriate compensation for today's success," he replied, the practiced ease of his words betraying their rehearsal. "But my daughter would lose the one person who has reached her, and you—" He paused, the deliberate gap in his sentence more effective than any direct threat. "Would lose an opportunity I suspect you need quite desperately." A memory flashed unbidden. Her handler's warning, delivered in the sterile hospital corridor. "Get close, gain access, but never compromise your position. If Xiao suspects anything, your mother gets nothing. No money, no donor, nothing." Lin Yu glanced at Xiao's desk, where a framed photo stood, his daughter in healthier days, laughing with uninhibited joy. The same daughter who had just taken her first willing meal in months. The moral compromise before her twisted into something even more complex. Refusing meant abandoning not just her mother, but also this clearly suffering child. "I'll need certain assurances," she said carefully, beginning the negotiation that would save one life, while potentially destroying others. "Name them." His immediate response revealed more eagerness than he likely intended. "My schedule remains my own. I maintain control over my cooking. No interference." And she hesitated, calculating how much she could demand without arousing suspicion. "I require a personal stipend, paid directly to me, not managed through household accounts." Xiao's eyebrow raised slightly, the closest thing to surprise his features seemed capable of displaying. Unusual requests for a bride, but acceptable, given the circumstances. What he couldn't know, was that the stipend would help support her mother's care while she waited for the promised kidney donor to materialize, that every meal she prepared would be an act of desperate love, not for his family, but for her own. "Then we have an agreement," she said, sealing a pact that would entangle her in a web far more complex than she had anticipated. The announcement came the following morning, delivered to the household staff with the same efficiency Xiao applied to corporate acquisitions. Within hours, Lin Yu's modest belongings were moved from the staff quarters to a suite adjacent to the family wing, close enough to fulfill her role, yet separate enough to maintain the fiction of propriety before the wedding. His daughter watched the proceedings with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope, occasionally touching her stomach as if still processing the unfamiliar sensation of being comfortably full. When she approached Lin Yu in a quiet moment, her question was disarmingly direct. "Are you marrying my father because of me?" Lin Yu looked into the eyes of this child, who had already endured so much, and found herself unable to offer another deception. "I'm marrying him because sometimes people find unexpected ways to help each other," she answered carefully. "And right now, we all need help in different ways." Lin Yu's carefully crafted plan had accounted for many obstacles, but not for the contradictions that began to emerge in her target. The business world called Xiao Zishan the Ice King, a man whose merciless decisions had toppled empires and left rivals in ruins. Yet she'd witnessed him watching his daughter with an expression that betrayed wounds too deep to name. This dichotomy puzzled her as she settled into her new role in the mansion, a reluctant fiancée with secrets of her own. Behind closed doors, away from business associates and competitors, Xiao sometimes revealed glimpses of a different man entirely. Lin Yu noticed it first in the small hours of morning, when she'd spotted him silently standing in the doorway of his daughter's room, watching her sleep with such naked concern that Lin Yu had quickly retreated, feeling as though she'd intruded on something intensely private. The vulnerability she'd glimpsed seemed impossible to reconcile with the man who reportedly negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. The staff spoke of Xiao in hushed, reverent tones, but their words revealed the carefully constructed nature of his public persona. "The master never shows weakness," an elderly housekeeper had whispered to Lin Yu while showing her around the East Wing. "Not since the madam passed. Some say he locked away his heart the same day they lowered her into the ground." Lin Yu's quarters afforded her unprecedented access to the family's inner sanctum, and with it came observations that increasingly troubled her mission. One evening, passing Xiao's private study, she glimpsed him through the partially open door, shoulders slumped over a faded photograph, his customary rigid posture abandoned. The sight lasted only seconds before he sensed her presence and straightened, mask firmly back in place. But the momentary transformation had been striking. From grieving man to calculating businessman in the space of a heartbeat. "Is there something you need?" he had asked, voice carefully modulated to betray nothing of what she'd witnessed. "Nothing that can't wait until morning," she'd replied, studying him with new interest. The incident sparked an unwelcome curiosity. Lin Yu began watching Xiao more carefully, noting the subtle shifts in his demeanor when he believed himself unobserved. The ruthless CEO's carefully crafted public persona was, she realized, exactly that, crafted with painstaking precision to project strength, decisiveness, and unwavering control. Beneath it lay a more complex reality, one that her handlers had either not known about or deliberately concealed from her. Through fragments of overheard conversations and careful observation, Lin Yu pieced together elements of the trauma that had forged Xiao's impenetrable exterior. His wife had died under circumstances that staff only referred to obliquely, exchanging meaningful glances rather than words. Corporate sabotage had somehow become deeply personal, a business rivalry transformed into something far more devastating. The timing suggested a connection between these events. Though no one spoke of this directly. The master changed after the investigation was closed, The security chief had remarked to his deputy one night, unaware that Lin Yu was within earshot in the adjacent room, started keeping everyone at arm's length, even his closest advisors. "Can you blame him?" the deputy had responded. "After what happened to the madam, I'd trust no one either." These conversations added pieces to a puzzle Lin Yu hadn't anticipated solving. The isolation and emotional distance that defined Xiao's leadership style wasn't simply a business strategy. It was a trauma response, a way to maintain control in a world that had proven unpredictable and cruel. His relentless work schedule, the emotional walls, the painstaking attention to security measures throughout the estate, all pointed to a man haunted by past events and determined to prevent their recurrence. Most revealing was observing Xiao's interactions with his daughter when they thought themselves alone. Lin Yu had witnessed a moment in the garden where Xiao had gently tucked a blanket around his daughter's shoulders as she read, a gesture so tender it seemed to belong to a different man entirely. When the girl had looked up in surprise, something like guilt had flashed across his features before the familiar mask descended once more. "You'll catch cold," he'd said, voice deliberately casual. "You used to sit with me," his daughter had replied quietly, before everything happened. Xiao had not answered, but his hand had lingered on her shoulder a moment longer than necessary before he retreated to a business call. The interaction left Lin Yu with an uncomfortable realization. The emotional distance that had contributed to his daughter's condition might stem from protective instinct rather than callous neglect. These observations created mounting dissonance with Lin Yu's mission parameters. Her handlers had described Xiao as calculating and emotionless, a man whose business dealings warranted investigation and potential exposure. Yet Lin Yu was witnessing a high-functioning individual channeling emotional energy into work, using it as a means of control and a way to avoid confronting inner pain. His workaholic tendencies seemed less like ruthless ambition and more like a desperate attempt to build something secure in a world that had proven itself unsafe. The contrast between public and private personas created an aura of mystery that Lin Yu found herself increasingly drawn to unravel. In the library one evening, she discovered a collection of documents hidden behind economic texts, plans for a children's medical foundation that bore his late wife's name, yet had never been publicly announced. Unlike his other philanthropic endeavors, which were carefully publicized to enhance the company image, this project appeared deeply personal, with handwritten notes in margins suggesting his direct involvement. Most troubling of all was the discovery Lin Yu made while organizing her recipes in Xiao's rarely used home office. A folder had slipped from a high shelf, spilling surveillance photos across the floor, images of men she recognized from her own recruitment, photographed in clandestine meetings with Xiao's closest business associates. The implications were staggering. The same people who had enlisted her to infiltrate the Xiao household were connected to individuals within his inner circle. The possibility that Xiao himself might be a victim of manipulation, rather than the orchestrator of wrongdoing, had never been presented to her. Lin Yu carefully replaced the photos, mind racing with questions she dared not ask directly. If her handlers had misrepresented Xiao's character, what else might they have lied about? The growing evidence suggested that the Ice King of Industry was a carefully constructed defense mechanism, rather than an accurate reflection of the man himself. Behind the frozen facade was someone far more complex, a grieving widower, a father consumed by guilt, perhaps even a target, rather than a perpetrator. As weeks passed, Lin Yu found herself in an increasingly precarious moral position. Her engagement had been a means to an end, access to resources that would save her mother's life. Yet each revelation about Xiao complicated her mission. The man she'd agreed to deceive was not the villain she'd been led to expect, and the thought of betraying him had begun to create a discomfort she hadn't anticipated. Each evening, Lin Yu noticed the same pattern. Xiao would return from work, check on his daughter, then disappear into his study, with only a glass of whiskey for company, while Zishan ate alone in her room. It was a distance measured not in meters, but in unspoken words, and Lin Yu realized with startling clarity that perhaps the path to both their hearts wasn't through secrets or schemes, but through their stomachs. The kitchen became her battlefield, a place where she could wage a quiet war against the grief that had built impenetrable walls between father and daughter. Food carries memory. Her grandmother had often whispered while grinding herbs in their tiny apartment kitchen. Now those words echoed in Lin Yu's mind as she stood before the mansion's gleaming stovetop. She wasn't just preparing nutrition, she was crafting emotional medicine, each dish designed to reach beyond the physical body and touch something deeper. Her training had always emphasized this holistic approach, food as a multisensory bridge to emotional well-being, not merely calories and vitamins. Lin Yu began carefully orchestrating meals that responded to the emotional climate of the household. When Zishan returned from school withdrawn and silent, Lin Yu prepared a congee infused with jujubes and longan, ingredients traditionally believed to soothe anxiety and lift spirits. The warming spices created an aroma that seemed to physically relax the girl's tense shoulders as she entered the kitchen. For Xiao, after days when his expression betrayed business pressures, even his perfect posture couldn't hide. Lin Yu crafted energizing dishes with ginger, astragalus root, and lean proteins, a businessman's version of comfort food that provided strength without heaviness. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, Lin Yu explained one evening, as she adjusted the flame beneath a simmering broth. Zishan had wandered into the kitchen, drawn by curious scents. My grandmother believed certain foods could unlock emotional pathways closed by trauma. She hadn't intended to say so much, but something about the girl's watchful eyes invited confidence. Lin Yu demonstrated how she was layering flavor, starting with a foundation of healing ingredients before building complexity. The technique transformed simple ingredients into something that resonated beyond taste, creating what her grandmother called emotional flavor memories. The most profound change began one Thursday evening, when Lin Yu took an unprecedented risk. Instead of sending separate meals to their respective corners of the mansion, she set 3 places at the family dining table, unused for months according to the staff. She prepared a single shared meal, home-style dishes, arranged family-style in the center of the table. When questioned by the housekeeper, Lin Yu simply said, "Healing happens in circles, not in straight lines." Xiao arrived home to find his daughter already seated at the table, eyeing the steaming dishes with cautious interest. The momentary confusion on his face gave way to something softer as he silently took his seat. The first shared meal passed with minimal conversation, just the sounds of utensils against fine china and occasional murmurs of appreciation. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. A door opened just enough to let in a whisper of possibility. "My mother used to make something similar," Zishan said during their third family dinner, breaking a silence that had stretched across the first 15 minutes of the meal. She was referring to the braised pork belly, tender enough to break apart with chopsticks. Lin Yu noticed how Xiao's hand paused mid-air, how his chest expanded with a breath held too long before he managed to respond. "She learned it from her mother," he said quietly. "I'd forgotten." It was the briefest exchange, but Lin Yu witnessed how Zishan's eyes lingered on her father's face afterward, studying him with new consideration. The shared memory of taste had created a momentary bridge between them, spanning what had seemed an impassable gulf of grief. As weeks passed, the dining table became sacred territory, a neutral ground where painful truths could emerge between past dishes and refilled teacups. Lin Yu listened more than she spoke, careful not to disrupt the fragile ecosystem of reconciliation. During one meal, after Zishan had mentioned a school project about family heritage, the conversation drifted to her mother. "Sometimes I think you stopped seeing me after she died," Zishan said suddenly, placing her chopsticks down with precise movements, "like I became invisible, or worse." just a reminder of what you lost. The weight of this truth hung heavily in the air as Xiao stared at his bowl. Lin Yu began to rise, sensing this moment wasn't meant for her presence. But Xiao's voice stopped her. "Please stay," he said, his typical commanding tone replaced by something raw. And then, turning to his daughter, "I thought by focusing on work, on providing everything material you could need, I was protecting you. I didn't know how to be both parents at once. I still don't." The conversation continued well past the cooling of the food. Dishes forgotten, as father and daughter began the tentative work of excavating 3 years of accumulated grief and misunderstanding. Lin Yu cleared the table quietly, understanding that the meal had accomplished exactly what it needed to, creating a container safe enough to hold difficult truths. Beyond family dinners, Lin Yu began teaching Zishan basic cooking techniques. What began as casual instruction, showing her how to julienne vegetables or steam fish properly, evolved into something more therapeutic. She noticed how the repetitive motions of chopping and stirring seemed to ground the girl, providing tangible focus during emotional discussions. "When we cook, we transform things," Lin Yu explained as they stood side by side at the counter, Zishan's thin fingers growing more confident with the knife. "We take separate ingredients, some bitter, some sweet, some bitter, some sweet, some difficult to digest alone, and create harmony." It wasn't subtle, but the metaphor wasn't lost on the increasingly perceptive teenager, who nodded thoughtfully while continuing her careful slicing. During these cooking lessons, Zishan began revealing fragments of herself, hesitant at first. Then, with growing confidence, she spoke of feeling abandoned twice, first by her mother's death, then by her father's emotional retreat. The kitchen became a confessional where painful truths could be expressed while hands remained productively occupied, diffusing the intensity that might have made such conversations impossible face to face. Lin Yu found herself caught in the complicated gravity of their healing. She had entered this household as an imposter, her culinary skills merely a tool for infiltration. Now those same skills were fostering genuine connection, complicating her mission in ways she hadn't anticipated. The lines between deception and authentic care grew increasingly blurred as she witnessed the transformation in both father and daughter. Zishan gaining weight and confidence. Zishan gaining weight and confidence, Xiao revealing glimpses of warmth beneath his calculated exterior. They were beginning to rely on her emotional presence as much as her cooking, creating an uncomfortable truth Lin Yu could no longer ignore. She was becoming the heart of a family built on a foundation of her lies. The meals she prepared with such care were healing wounds she had never intended to treat, creating bonds she had never planned to honor. Each day brought her closer to a devastating choice between betrayal and loyalty, between her mother's life and the fragile trust of those who had unwittingly given her their hearts, along with a place at their table. The warmth of the kitchen, that had become Lin Yu's sanctuary, began to feel like a carefully constructed illusion, masking something sinister beneath the surface. Late one night, as she returned to retrieve a forgotten recipe book, a half-open office door revealed Xiao's head of security hunched over medical files. Zishan's medical files. Zishan's medical files. With an expression that made Lin Yu's blood run cold, she froze, pressing herself against the wall, heart hammering against her ribs as she caught fragments of a hushed phone conversation. "The dosage has been adjusted. Yes, symptoms consistent with our expectations, mimicking the target condition perfectly." Lin Yu had entered this household, built on her own deception. But what if she had unwittingly stepped into something far more monstrous? As the security chief gathered the files and headed toward the door, she slipped into an alcove, barely daring to breathe until his footsteps faded down the corridor. Her hands trembled as a horrifying possibility crystallized in her mind. What if Zishan's condition wasn't simply psychological? What if someone was deliberately poisoning the girl? The following morning, Lin Yu watched Zishan with new eyes as the girl sipped her morning tea, the subtle tremor in her hands, the faint yellowish tinge to her complexion that Lin Yu had attributed to malnutrition. These symptoms suddenly took on a sinister dimension. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize not just the healing properties of ingredients, but also their potential as toxins when misused. The pattern of Zishan's symptoms didn't align perfectly with anorexia. There were inconsistencies Lin Yu had dismissed, but now couldn't ignore. "Is everything all right?" Zishan asked, catching Lin Yu's intense gaze. "You're looking at me strangely?" Lin Yu forced a smile. "Just thinking about a new recipe," she lied, the irony of adding another deception to her growing collection not lost on her. "How do you feel after breakfast?" "Tired," Zishan admitted. "I always feel so tired after eating. That's why I used to avoid it." Another piece clicked into place. Not a normal response to nourishment, even for someone recovering from an eating disorder. Lin Yu's suspicions deepened, but investigating further would mean risking her cover, potentially jeopardizing both her mother's life and her own. Yet ignoring her suspicions meant possibly allowing harm to continue befalling Zishan, the girl who had come to trust her so completely. Lin Yu began a careful campaign of intelligence gathering, using her role as family chef to move freely throughout the mansion. She volunteered to deliver snacks to staff meetings, timing her arrivals to catch snippets of conversations that ceased abruptly when she entered. She cataloged which staff members had access to Zishan's food and medications, noting that the girl's symptoms worsened noticeably after certain individuals delivered her meals. The security chief, in particular, seemed to have an unusual interest in Zishan's medical care for someone whose job supposedly focused on the family's physical safety. During her third week of covert investigation, Lin Yu discovered a locked cabinet in the rarely used tea room adjacent to Xiao's study. Using the pretext of preparing a special medicinal brew, she managed to keep the elderly housekeeper talking long enough to notice which vase concealed the key. That night, after everyone had retired, she slipped back downstairs, heart pounding, as she unlocked the cabinet. Inside, she found a leather portfolio containing documents bearing the Xiao Corporation logo, but with an unfamiliar subdivision name, Organ Procurement Initiative. Bile rose in her throat as she scanned shipping manifests, payment records, and medical compatibility charts, evidence of an elaborate international organ trafficking operation. Most disturbing was a document listing potential donors, with Zishan's name appearing in a separate category labeled Insurance Assets. "Insurance assets," Lin Yu whispered, the meaning becoming horrifyingly clear. Zishan wasn't just being poisoned. She was being maintained in a state of controlled illness as leverage in some complex corporate scheme. The symptoms were being carefully managed to mimic an eating disorder, while gradually damaging her organs, perhaps to create a justifiable need for transplants that would mask the operation's true nature. The sudden sound of footsteps in the hallway sent Lin Yu scrambling to replace the documents. She had barely locked the cabinet and slipped behind a curtain when the security chief entered, accompanied by the same man who had recruited Lin Yu at the hospital months ago. The realization hit her with stunning force. The very people who had arranged her infiltration of the Xiao family were involved in the organ trafficking operation. "The CEO is becoming a problem," the recruiter said. "He's asking too many questions about the medical division's finances. That's why we have his daughter," the security chief replied. "When the time comes, he'll make the right decision, or she'll suffer an unfortunate setback. He'd sign over the entire company to save her." Lin Yu pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle her gasp. Her mother's promised kidney donor, the one she had bargained her integrity for, wasn't some wealthy patient making a legal-directed donation. The organ would almost certainly come from this trafficking ring, making her not just a deceiver, but an unwitting accomplice to something monstrous. The next day, Lin Yu began substituting ingredients in Zishan's meals, incorporating traditional detoxifying elements that would help cleanse the girl's system without drawing attention. She studied the mansion's security patterns, noting when she could access certain areas unobserved. She needed proof concrete enough to convince Xiao, whose trust she had gained through deception, but now desperately needed to save his daughter. Late one evening, Lin Yu slipped into the security office during the shift change, using techniques she'd learned while observing the household staff. With shaking hands, she downloaded files from the computer onto a small drive hidden in her apron pocket. Just as she was about to leave, the door handle turned. With nowhere to hide, she ducked beneath the desk, watching in terror as the security chief's polished shoes stepped into view. He moved around the room, checking various monitors, before pausing directly in front of the desk. Lin Yu held her breath, certain her pounding heart would give her away. A phone rang, drawing him across the room. The moment he turned his back, she slipped out, keeping low and praying the cameras she'd carefully noted earlier wouldn't capture her escape. "There you are," came Xiao's voice from the corridor, startling her so badly she nearly dropped her evidence. "I've been looking for you." Lin Yu clutched the thumb drive in her palm, smiling with a calmness she didn't feel. "I was just checking on some special ingredients I stored away." Xiao's gaze lingered on her face. "Searching. You seem troubled lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" The question hung between them, an invitation to honesty that could unravel everything. Lin Yu had entered this house as a liar, but now found herself in possession of truths so dangerous they could destroy both her deception and the very people she had come to care for. The evidence in her hand could save Zishan, but would expose her own fraudulent identity. The kidney promised for her mother was tainted with criminality, making the entire foundation of her mission a moral catastrophe. "I'm just concerned about some aspects of Zishan's recovery," she finally said, choosing her words carefully. "There are some inconsistencies I'm trying to understand." Xiao nodded, his face softening with genuine concern. "Your attention to her well-being means everything to me. Whatever you need to help her, just ask." The kitchen, that had once been Lin Yu's refuge, was about to become her battlefield. 3 short raps on the front door the next morning announced the arrival of Shijin, the legendary culinary executioner, whose scathing reviews had closed more 5-star restaurants than health inspectors. He stood in the foyer with cold eyes that had once dismissed Lin Yu from his prestigious cooking academy years ago. Eyes that now swept past her without recognition, as he announced his intention to evaluate the mysterious chef who had miraculously cured Zishan's condition. "I find it suspicious that a complete unknown has accomplished what culinary masters could not," Shijin declared to Xiao, his voice carrying the authority of his position as leader of the Culinary Alliance. "The rapid recovery of your daughter defies medical explanation. I suspect theatrical tricks rather than genuine culinary skill." He turned to Lin Yu with a dismissive glance. "If you are indeed the miracle worker they claim, you won't object to proving it in a proper assessment." Lin Yu felt her pulse quicken as memories flooded back, standing before this same man 7 years earlier as he tore apart her scholarship application, declaring her techniques provincial and lacking sophistication. Now he stood before her again, not recognizing the woman whose culinary dreams he had once shattered. She met his gaze steadily, careful to mask the recognition in her eyes. Xiao watched the exchange with calculated interest. "What exactly are you proposing, Shijin?" "A 3-course challenge. Traditional themes, executed with technical perfection." Shijin's thin lips curved into what passed for a smile. "If your fiancé is truly qualified to hold such an esteemed position in your household, this should present no difficulty." The stakes of this unexpected challenge crystallized in Lin Yu's mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't merely about professional validation. Her entire precarious position within the Xiao family hung in the balance. If she failed to impress Shijin, questions would multiply about her qualifications and identity. More critically, her access to the resources needed to save her mother would evaporate. "I accept," Lin Yu said simply, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. The staff's reaction was immediate and revealing. The head chef's expression flickered between concern and something darker, anticipation of her potential failure. 2 sous chefs exchanged meaningful glances, while the kitchen manager stepped forward with exaggerated helpfulness. "I'll ensure you have everything you need, Miss Lin," he offered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As preparations began, Lin Yu retreated to a quiet corner of the vast kitchen, closing her eyes briefly to center herself. 7 years ago, standing before Shijin, she had attempted to impress him with technical flourishes borrowed from famous chefs. Today, she would make no such mistake. Reaching into her apron pocket, she withdrew a small, worn notebook, not the one containing her grandmother's recipes, but her own personal evolution of those teachings. The competition parameters were announced: appetizer, main course, and dessert, each demonstrating different aspects of traditional healing cuisine. Lin Yu moved with deliberate calm as she sketched her menu, aware of the whispers among the kitchen staff who had never accepted her elevated status in the household. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she began preparing her first course. She selected ingredients with purpose: goji berries soaked in chrysanthemum tea, wild mushrooms harvested during specific moon phases, motivational profiles. Each component carried significance beyond mere flavor, embodying the principle her grandmother had instilled. The elements must speak to both the body and the spirit. A memory surfaced as she worked, sitting cross-legged beside her grandmother's cooking fire at age 9, watching with wonder as the elderly woman transformed humble ingredients into dishes that neighbors traveled miles to taste. "These techniques are not for showing off," her grandmother had warned, pressing a gnarled finger against Lin Yu's small chest. "They are for healing. Remember that power without purpose becomes poison." The kitchen hummed with tension as Lin Yu completed her appetizer, a delicate mushroom consomme with crystal-clear broth that carried complex layers of flavor. As she turned to retrieve her handcrafted ceramic bowls, she noticed the head chef slide something into the reduction sauce for her main course. The sabotage was as expected as it was disheartening. Without confrontation, Lin Yu calmly discarded the compromised sauce and began again, keeping her ingredients closer and her movements more guarded. Time constraints tightened around her like a vise, but her hands remained steady. This was not her first experience with kitchen sabotage. Working in understaffed restaurants had taught her vigilance alongside speed. Shijin observed from a high stool, his expression impenetrable, as Lin Yu presented her first course. He tasted with clinical precision, making notes without comment. The silence was more unnerving than criticism would have been. For her main course, Lin Yu prepared a dish her grandmother had reserved for those recovering from serious illness: steamed sea bass with a broth of 13 precisely balanced ingredients, each chosen to support different body systems. The preparation method required absolute temperature control, achieved not with modern equipment, but with the ancient technique of listening to the sound of steam as it rose through bamboo. "Your methods are unorthodox," Shijin noted, the first words he'd spoken since the tasting began. "There's no consistency in your technique." Lin Yu looked up from her careful arrangement of the fish. "Consistency isn't always the goal when healing is the purpose," she replied. "Each ingredient responds differently to heat and time. I listen to what the food requires, not what tradition dictates." Shijin's eyebrow raised fractionally, the closest he came to showing surprise, as Lin Yu completed her final course, a dessert of fermented rice pudding with seasonal fruits prepared 5 different ways. She became aware of Zishan standing quietly in the doorway, observing. Their eyes met briefly, and Lin Yu saw something unexpected in the young girl's gaze: concern for her. The final presentation was assembled with quiet confidence. Unlike the showy gastronomy favored in competition, Lin Yu's offering was understated, focusing attention on the ingredients themselves rather than technical virtuosity. The 3 courses created a progression that reflected her philosophy: cleansing, strengthening, and balancing. Shijin tasted the final dish, in complete silence. The kitchen staff held their collective breath as he made his final notes, his expression giving nothing away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried throughout the hushed kitchen. "Your techniques are unconventional and would not meet classical standards," he began, and Lin Yu felt her heart sink. He continued after a punishing pause. "There is undeniable integrity in your approach. Each dish speaks with a clear voice about your understanding of food as medicine. It is authentic in a way that technical perfection often fails to achieve." He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I withdraw my objections to your position in this household." The validation from her former critic should have felt triumphant, but Lin Yu understood the double-edged nature of this victory. As kitchen staff dispersed with mixed reactions, Xiao approached with unmistakable pride in his expression, a complication to her already conflicted emotions. "You've done more than prove your skills," he said quietly. "You've reminded me what real cooking should be." With Xiao's unexpected praise lingering in the air, Lin Yu found herself standing at a dangerous crossroads. The line between pretense and authenticity had begun to blur in ways she never anticipated. Each morning, she awoke with the weight of her deception pressing against her chest. Yet each evening, she found herself looking forward to those quiet moments with the man she was supposed to betray. When had this arrangement of convenience transformed into something that made her heart quicken whenever he entered a room? Late one night, Lin Yu stood in the kitchen, preparing a midnight snack of ginger tea and almond cookies. She hadn't expected company, especially not Xiao's. He appeared in the doorway, his usual crisp suit replaced by casual loungewear that softened his imposing presence. "You can't sleep either?" he asked, the question hanging between them like a bridge. Neither was certain would hold their weight. "I find kitchens peaceful at night," she replied, sliding a cup of tea toward him. He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I used to think peaceful meant silent and empty," he said, studying the amber liquid. "I'm beginning to reconsider that definition." These nocturnal encounters became an unspoken ritual between them. Sometimes they spoke of inconsequential things, a book he was reading, a new technique she wanted to try. Other nights they shared deeper fragments of themselves. He described his childhood dreams before business consumed his life. She spoke of her grandmother's wisdom, carefully editing out details that might reveal her true identity. What began as calculated moves in an elaborate deception had evolved into genuine moments of connection. Lin Yu found herself sharing stories of her past, the real ones, only changing names and places to maintain her cover. The truths woven through her lies made the deception all the more painful. One evening, after Zishan had gone to bed, Xiao joined Lin Yu on the terrace overlooking the garden. The night air carried the scent of jasmine as they sat in comfortable silence. "You've changed things here," Xiao said finally, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Not just Zishan's health. The house itself feels different." Lin Yu looked at him, surprised by his openness. "Different how?" "Like a home again," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him something. "After my wife died, I buried myself in work. I convinced myself that providing financially was enough, that emotional presence was secondary." He paused, staring into the distance. "I was wrong, and Zishan paid the price for that mistake." Each confession made Lin Yu's deception cut deeper. The man before her wasn't the heartless tycoon she'd been sent to infiltrate, but someone who had lost his way through grief and was finding his path back through the very connection she would eventually betray. Meanwhile, unknown to Lin Yu, Xiao had begun piecing together the inconsistencies in her story, not out of suspicion, but out of a desire to truly know the woman who had brought healing back into his home. The investigation, driven by genuine interest rather than mistrust, had uncovered discrepancies that couldn't be ignored. Restaurants she claimed to have worked at with no record of her employment, references who seemed confused when contacted, a past that dissolved under scrutiny. Lin Yu discovered this investigation by accident. While retrieving a cookbook from Xiao's study, she noticed a folder with her false name on it. Inside were photographs of places she'd never been, interviews with people she'd never been, interviews with people she'd never met, all exposing the elaborate fiction she'd constructed. Her hands trembled as she replaced the folder. How much did he know? What was his intention? The uncertainty plagued her, transforming their intimate moments into exercises in paranoia. Was he playing along, gathering evidence, or was there something else driving his investigation? The next morning, Lin Yu noticed Xiao watching her as she taught Zishan how to properly slice ginger. His gaze held something she couldn't decipher, not anger or suspicion, but something more complex, almost tender. It terrified her, more than outright accusation would have. That evening, she found a small box outside her door. Inside was a rare herb she'd once mentioned her grandmother used, one that wasn't part of her false identity's backstory, but from her real past. A note simply read, "For your collection, I thought you might miss this." The gesture paralyzed her with its intimacy. He was reaching out to her real self, the person behind the facade, without directly confronting the deception. It was an opening, a chance to step into truth. The emotional toll of maintaining her deception while developing real feelings became increasingly unbearable. During one of their late-night conversations, Lin Yu nearly confessed everything. The words gathered in her throat, about her mother, about the deal she'd made, about her fear that exposing the trafficking ring would cost her mother the kidney she desperately needed. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Xiao's phone rang with an urgent business matter, and the moment shattered. As weeks passed, the ethical dilemma intensified. How could she betray the trust of a man and his daughter, who had, despite everything, come to mean so much to her? But how could she abandon her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her? The turning point came during a rare family outing. Zishan had expressed interest in visiting a traditional market, and Lin Yu suggested they go together. To her surprise, Xiao cleared his schedule to join them. As they wandered through stalls of fresh produce and spices, Lin Yu watched Xiao and his daughter laugh together over a street vendor's antics. The genuine joy on their faces, joy she had helped cultivate, made her decision clear. She couldn't continue the deception, regardless of the consequences. That night, Lin Yu sat at her desk, drafting a letter confessing everything. Her real identity, her mother's condition, the people who had recruited her, and the trafficking operation she'd uncovered. She would give it to Xiao in the morning, then face whatever came next. But fate had other plans. As she sealed the envelope containing her confession, urgent knocking rattled her door. One of the household staff stood there, face pale with panic. "It's Zishan," the woman gasped. "She's collapsed." Lin Yu rushed to Zishan's room to find the girl unconscious, her skin ashen. Xiao knelt beside the bed, his composed facade completely shattered. When he looked up at Lin Yu, his eyes held raw desperation. "Help her," he pleaded. "Whatever is happening, please help her." In that moment, Lin Yu understood that her confession would have to wait. As she checked Zishan's vitals, her culinary training in traditional medicine took over. The symptoms pointed to poisoning, deliberate and calculated. "We need to get her to a hospital," she said firmly. "And on the way, there's something I need to tell you." As they rushed to the car, Lin Yu realized the crisis had forced her hand in ways she hadn't anticipated. The truth would come out not in a carefully worded letter, but in the chaotic aftermath of an emergency. Truth laid bare not by choice, but by necessity. Truth reveals itself in the most inopportune moments. As the car sped toward the hospital with Zishan unconscious in the back seat, Lin Yu's planned confession transformed from a carefully crafted letter into the chaotic aftermath of an emergency. The headlights of 3 black sedans suddenly appeared in the rearview mirror, gaining on them with alarming speed. "We have company," Xiao muttered, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Who would follow us now?" Lin Yu turned, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead vehicle. "They're not following us to help," she whispered, the weight of realization crushing her chest. "They're here for me." First sedan accelerated, cutting them off at an intersection and forcing Xiao to slam the brakes. The other two vehicles boxed them in with practiced precision. 5 men emerged, including the hospital administrator, who had first approached Lin Yu with the deceptive proposition months ago. "Your time playing house with the CEO is over," he announced through Xiao's window. "You had one job: get close enough to access his private files and transfer the medical division's oversight to our team. Instead, you've been cooking dinner and playing family." Xiao's expression hardened as he turned to Lin Yu, betrayal etching deep lines around his eyes. "Is this true?" The moment stretched between them like a chasm. In the back seat, Zishan stirred. Her breathing labored. Lin Yu made her choice. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But not everything was a lie." She turned to the men surrounding the car. "And I know what you're really doing with the medical division. The organ trafficking, the falsified donor list. I've seen it all." The hospital administrator's face contorted with rage. "Get them both. And the girl too. We can still salvage her as a donor." What followed was chaos. Despite his shock at Lin Yu's confession, reacted with surprising agility, reversing the car violently before anyone could open the doors. One of the men drew a gun, shattering the rear window. Glass rained over Zishan's unconscious form. As Lin Yu threw herself protectively over the child, they managed to break free, but one of the sedans stayed in pursuit. As Xiao navigated the streets with desperate focus, Lin Yu finally spoke the complete truth. Her real name, her mother dying in a county hospital across town, the blackmail that had forced her hand. "I was supposed to help them take control of your medical division," she explained, wiping blood from a cut on her cheek. "They promised my mother a kidney and treatment she couldn't afford otherwise. I didn't know until later that the organs they traffic come from unwilling donors. People like your daughter, kept deliberately ill as potential assets." Xiao's face remained impassive, but his white-knuckled grip on the wheel revealed his turmoil, and Zishan's condition induced, gradually, small amounts of poison administered by your head of security and several staff members. They wanted her weak enough to justify extraordinary measures if necessary, but alive as leverage. When they finally reached the hospital, doctors rushed Zishan into emergency care. In the sterile waiting room, with his daughter's life hanging in the balance, Xiao finally confronted Lin Yu fully. "Every moment between us? Was any of it real?" he asked, his voice hollow. Lin Yu met his gaze without flinching. "The deception brought me into your home. Everything that happened after, the meals, the midnight conversations, helping Zishan heal, those choices were mine, not part of any plan." The conversation halted as a doctor emerged with news. Zishan would recover, but they'd found traces of thallium in her system, confirming Lin Yu's revelation about the poisoning. Before Xiao could respond, hospital security alerted them that men matching the description of their attackers had entered the building. "We need to move," Xiao said, his businessman's mind quickly formulating a plan. "I'll contact federal authorities, but first we need somewhere safe." They relocated Zishan to a private facility under an assumed name. That night, in a safe house arranged by Xiao's few remaining trusted associates, Lin Yu found herself facing Zishan, now conscious and aware of everything that had happened. The girl's eyes, still rimmed with shadows from months of illness, held Lin Yu in a gaze that demanded honesty. "You weren't who you said you were." "No," Lin Yu admitted, sitting at the edge of Zishan's bed. "I wasn't. But the food, when you cooked for me, was that part real?" Lin Yu nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "My grandmother taught me everything I know. Those recipes, that knowledge. It's the most honest part of me." Zishan studied her for a long moment. "You made me feel better when no one else could, even if it was a lie at first. You still did that." She paused, wisdom beyond her years showing in her eyes. "And you tried to protect me in the car." From the doorway, Xiao watched this exchange in silence. The complexity of emotions on his face reflected his internal struggle. Anger at the deception, warring with gratitude for his daughter's recovery, and newfound voice. The next morning brought federal agents and the dismantling of the trafficking operation. Xiao's most trusted advisors were implicated, their betrayal cutting deeper than Lin Yu's deception. Evidence showed they had been operating the scheme for years, using Xiao's legitimate medical research division as cover while siphoning resources and endangering vulnerable patients. Lin Yu provided testimony that proved crucial to the investigation. She also insisted on one condition: immediate medical care for her mother, transferred to the same private facility where Zishan was recovering. 3 days after the revelations, Lin Yu prepared to leave. Her mother was stable, the conspirators were in custody, and her purpose in the Xiao household had reached its natural conclusion. But before departing, she made one final meal. In the safe house kitchen, working with limited ingredients and borrowed tools, Lin Yu prepared a simple feast: congee with century eggs, steamed fish with ginger and scallions, stir-fried vegetables with garlic, and sweet red bean soup. Nothing elaborate or technically demanding, but dishes infused with the essence of home and healing. When Xiao and Zishan entered the dining room, Lin Yu served them in silence. No explanations, no defenses, just food offered as both apology and farewell. They ate together one last time, the silence eventually giving way to Zishan's quiet questions about ingredients and techniques. As the meal concluded, Xiao finally spoke. "I've been blind," he admitted, "not just to the corruption in my company, but to what matters most. I focused on empire, building while neglecting to see the threats within my own walls." He looked at Lin Yu directly to see the threats within my own walls. He looked at Lin Yu directly. "You entered my home as a deception, yet somehow became its greatest truth. Tell her." Lin Yu shook her head. "I'm still the person who lied to you both." "Yes," Xiao acknowledged. "And also the person who ultimately saved us, at great risk to yourself." Their conversation was interrupted by news that federal agents had secured Lin Yu's mother's ongoing treatment and legal immunity for Lin Yu in exchange for her continued cooperation with the investigation. "What will you do now?" Zishan asked Lin Yu, her eyes revealing attachment despite the betrayal. Lin Yu looked at them both, the man she had never intended to care for, and the child she had grown to love. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "For the first time in my life, I have no plan, no script to follow." The absence of a plan sometimes creates space for something far more valuable than certainty. As Lin Yu's protective walls crumbled around her, a strange paradox emerged. The very lies that should have destroyed them might become the foundation for something unexpectedly genuine. 3 months had passed since the night everything unraveled. The Xiao mansion now existed in a delicate state of reconstruction, both literally and figuratively. Workers moved through the East Wing, replacing surveillance systems installed by the former security team with transparent security protocols. Similar renovations occurred within the relationships that remained standing amid the rubble of deception. Lin Yu arranged fresh chrysanthemums in her mother's hospital room, a routine that had become sacred to her. The private facility, tucked away in the countryside, provided the serene environment her mother needed for recovery. The transplant had been successful, this time with an ethically sourced kidney from a registered donor program that Xiao personally vetted. Her mother's color had returned, and today she sat up without assistance, her eyes clearer than Lin Yu had seen in years. "He's coming again today?" her mother asked, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Lin Yu nodded, unable to hide the complicated emotions that surfaced whenever Xiao visited. According to research in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, rebuilding trust after profound deception requires acknowledging the harm caused, expressing sincere remorse, and making amends. These crucial first steps had begun, but the path forward remained uncertain. "You know what your grandmother would say," her mother continued, reaching for Lin Yu's hand. "Sometimes the pot needs to crack before the most complex flavors can escape." When Xiao arrived, an hour later, he carried no extravagant gifts, only a simple thermal container. The three sat together, sharing the soup he had attempted to make following Lin Yu's recipe. It was imperfect. The broth, slightly too salty, the timing of the ingredients not quite right, but his effort spoke volumes. This small act represented what experts called demonstrating a consistent commitment to change, another vital element in the trust-building process. Back at the mansion, Zishan waited for their return. Her recovery had become a collaborative effort, requiring more than just Lin Yu's culinary expertise. The Journal of Family Psychologies noted that successful blended families often develop strong and open communication patterns, which was precisely what they were attempting to build. A new kind of family unit born from unusual circumstances. "I've been practicing," Zishan announced when they returned, proudly displaying a plate of dumplings she had shaped herself, each one slightly lopsided, but formed with obvious care. Lin Yu watched as Xiao examined his daughter's creations, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering guilt. The gap between them had narrowed considerably, but some wounds needed more than a few months to fully heal. "The trick is in how you fold the edges," Lin Yu demonstrated, guiding Zishan's fingers through the motion. "It's like creating a secret compartment for the flavors to develop." The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. Southtown, the transformation of the Xiao Corporation headquarters, reflected the personal changes occurring within the family. The medical division had been completely restructured, with oversight committees and transparency protocols that would have been unimaginable under previous leadership. According to the Harvard Business Review, research on ethical transformations after corporate scandals, successful transformations often involved a decisive change in leadership, a firm commitment to transparency and accountability, and the implementation of new ethical guidelines. Xiao had embraced these principles with the same intensity he once directed toward profit margins. His testimony against former board members and executives had sent shockwaves through the business community. Many predicted the company's downfall, but something unexpected happened instead. Employee morale improved dramatically, and investor confidence gradually returned, drawn to the company's renewed ethical foundation. On the ground floor of the headquarters, construction crews were finishing Lin Yu's newest venture, a restaurant focused on healing cuisine, accessible to both employees and the public. The space represented a fusion of their worlds, her culinary heritage combined with his resources. The restaurant would serve as both a business and an educational center, teaching the principles of food as medicine that Lin Yu had learned from her grandmother. "I never thought I'd see the name Lin above the door of a Xiao building," Lin Yu remarked one evening, reviewing the designs with Xiao in his home office. "It's your name?" he replied simply. "It should be your restaurant." The exchange highlighted what the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin described as increased feelings of closeness and commitment that often develop when couples navigate significant crises together. Their relationship had been forged through fire, creating a sense of shared identity and mutual support, which strengthens the bond between partners. Yet despite these positive developments, Lin Yu occasionally found herself paralyzed by the weight of their past. During a particularly difficult evening, she confronted Xiao directly. "How can you trust anything about us?" she asked. Xiao considered her question carefully before responding, the moonlight casting shadows across his face. "I've been thinking about ingredients," he said finally. "Ingredients? You taught Zishan that the quality of ingredients matters most, but also that sometimes bitter elements are necessary for balance." He paused. "Your deception was bitter, but perhaps necessary for the truth that followed." This perspective aligned with research, suggesting that relationships strengthened through crisis and truth-telling often experience a deeper level of intimacy and resilience. The painful honesty that had exposed their deceptions had also cleared the way for authentic connection. Zishan became the unexpected bridge in their tentative reconciliation. Her recovery, physical and emotional, required both of them, creating a common purpose that transcended their complicated past. During family meals, now a sacred ritual in the household. She often orchestrated conversations that forced both adults to confront uncomfortable truths while celebrating small victories. "Dad actually laughed today during the board meeting," she announced one evening. His assistant said everyone nearly fell out of their chairs. Lin Yu smiled at this transformation, remembering the steel-faced executive she had first encountered. The man sitting across from her now still possessed that strength, but it had been tempered with something essential. The revelation of Lin Yu's connection to the Yu culinary king had initially created another ripple of shock through their fragile peace. When the famous chef arrived at the mansion, openly acknowledging Lin Yu as his mentor and the true creative force behind his empire, Xiao had withdrawn briefly, processing yet another layer of deception. But rather than creating another barrier, this truth ultimately offered Lin Yu the freedom to fully step into her talents without pretense. "I spent so long hiding who I was," she confessed to Xiao afterward, "first from necessity, then from habit, until I almost forgot myself." "And now?" he asked. "Now I'm remembering," she answered honestly. "It feels like waking up." Their relationship progressed with careful deliberation, neither rushing nor avoiding the difficult conversations necessary for healing. They established new traditions, cooking together on Sunday evenings, taking Zishan to explore local markets, holding family meetings, where honesty was the only requirement. These rituals created what researchers called a foundation of authenticity and understanding within the relationship, fostering a more profound and lasting connection. 6 months after the revelations, during the soft opening of Lin Yu's restaurant, Xiao watched from across the crowded room as she explained the philosophy behind a particularly complex dish to an enthralled food critic. Her confidence had blossomed as she embraced her true identity and expertise. In that moment, he recognized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. His admiration for her had nothing to do with convenience or arrangement. It had everything to do with who she truly was. Later that evening, as they walked through the garden, where Zishan was showing her grandmother the herbs she had planted, Xiao stopped Lin Yu with a gentle touch on her arm. "I have no script for this," he admitted. "I've never been in a relationship that wasn't defined by advantage or obligation." Lin Yu looked at them both, the man she had never intended to care for, and the child she had grown to love. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "For the first time in my life, I have no plan, no script to follow." As the final chapters of Lin Yu and Xiao's story unfolded, something remarkable emerged from the ashes of deception. Truth, bitter and disruptive as it was, became the foundation upon which genuine bonds formed, stronger than any fabrication could sustain. The path to healing wasn't instantaneous. Each confession peeled away another layer of protection. Each moment of vulnerability risked further pain. Yet in that raw authenticity, they discovered connections impossible to forbade through pretense. The Xiao family's transformation reminds us that only after confronting our deepest lies can we build relationships worth preserving. Like master chefs, they learned that the most nourishing connections require both patience and courage, honesty being the essential ingredient no recipe can omit.